This is the headline they told you would never happen. For decades, the United States dollar has been untouchable, sacred, the reserve currency of the entire planet. Nations hoarded it. Central banks worshipped it. Economies were built on the assumption that the greenback would never, ever be challenged by an ally. But this morning, Wednesday, March 11th, 2026, that assumption just died. Breaking news out of Ottawa has sent shockwaves through every trading floor on Earth. The Bank of Canada, acting on an emergency directive from Prime Minister Mark Carney's cabinet, has announced the complete and immediate diversification of Canada's foreign reserve holdings away from the United States dollar. We are not talking about a partial shift. We are not talking about a symbolic rebalancing. We are talking about $1.2 trillion in reserve assets being systematically pulled out of US Treasury bonds, dollar-denominated instruments, and American financial institutions. The announcement came at 6 a.m. Eastern before the New York markets opened. That was deliberate. That was a financial ambush. Canada, America's largest trading partner, the nation that shares the longest undefended border in human history, the country that has been joined at the economic hip to the United States since Bretton Woods, has just declared monetary independence, and Washington didn't see it coming. The White House is in full crisis mode. The Treasury Department has called an emergency session. The Federal Reserve is reportedly convening an unscheduled board meeting. And the president is said to be furious, blindsided by what sources inside the West Wing are calling the most significant act of economic warfare ever committed by a so-called ally. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how Canada pulled this off. We are going to explain the financial mechanics of a reserve currency divorce. We are going to reveal the leaked diplomatic cables that show this was months in the making. And we are going to answer the question that every American should be asking right now. If Canada can dump the dollar, who's next? Buckle up. The world just changed. To understand why Ottawa moved today, we have to go back to the trade war that started it all. Remember the sweeping tariffs the administration imposed on Canadian goods in late 2025? The 25% levy on Canadian aluminum, the 18% surcharge on softwood lumber, the reclassification of Canadian dairy as a national security threat under Section 232. For months, Canada negotiated. They sent envoys. They offered concessions. Prime Minister Carney, a former central banker himself, a man who ran the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, tried every diplomatic channel available. He understood the financial system better than anyone in the room, and he was ignored. Sources at the Canadian Ministry of Finance say the final straw came on February 28, 2026, when the US Trade Representative's office rejected Ottawa's proposed compromise without even reading it. The rejection memo, leaked to the Globe and Mail last week, was 3 sentences long. 3 sentences to dismiss a 60-page bilateral framework. Carney reportedly told his inner circle that evening, they don't want a partner, they want a vassal, and Canada will never be a vassal. And here's where it really gets serious. The reserve diversification wasn't a snap decision. It was a contingency plan that had been developed in secret since November 2025, codenamed Project Sovereignty. The Bank of Canada, working with the Caisse de dépôt in Montreal and the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, quietly began identifying alternative reserve instruments. They mapped out a phased exit from US Treasuries. They established new currency swap lines with the European Central Bank, the People's Bank of China, and the Bank of Japan. They even negotiated emergency gold purchase agreements with the London Bullion Market Association. The entire operation was kept to a circle of fewer than 12 people. No leaks, no warnings, until this morning. The mechanics of this are devastating for the United States. Here's what you need to understand about what happens when $1.2 trillion starts moving. Target 1, US Treasury bonds. Canada held approximately $320 billion in American government debt. When a holder of that magnitude starts selling, it doesn't just lower the price, it triggers a cascade. Other foreign holders see the sell orders and panic. They think, if Canada is running, what do they know that we don't? The yield on the 10-year Treasury spiked 47 basis points in the first 2 hours of trading this morning. That is a seismic move. That translates directly into higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, and higher credit card rates for every American household by Friday. Target 2, the currency markets. The Canadian dollar surged 3.2% against the greenback in overnight trading. The euro climbed 2.1%. The Swiss franc, the traditional safe haven, jumped 4.7%. The dollar index, the DXY, which measures the dollar against a basket of major currencies, fell to 94.3. It hasn't been that low since 2021. Target 3, the petrodollar system. Canada is the largest supplier of oil to the United States, 4 million barrels a day. If Canada begins pricing its oil exports in Canadian dollars or in a basket of currencies rather than exclusively in US dollars, the petrodollar framework that has underpinned American financial dominance since 1974 starts to fracture. The Saudis are watching this. OPEC is watching this. Every oil-producing nation that has ever quietly resented being forced to trade in dollars is watching this and thinking, if Canada can do it, so can we. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Let me explain why this is even more devastating than it sounds on the surface. The reserve diversification isn't just about selling bonds. It's about dismantling the financial architecture that has given the United States a unique privilege for 80 years, the ability to borrow money at artificially low rates because the entire world needs dollars. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege. France's finance minister coined that phrase in the 1960s. It means that because every country needs dollars to trade oil, to settle international contracts, to hold as reserves, there is a permanent built-in demand for U.S. debt. That demand keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. It lets the American government run deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. It is, in effect, a hidden tax on the rest of the world that subsidizes the American standard of living. Canada just stopped paying that tax, and they're encouraging everyone else to stop paying it too. The logic behind Carney's move is brutal and precise. He didn't just wake up angry and dump the dollar. He picked the moment of maximum American vulnerability. The U.S. national debt stands at $37.2 trillion. The deficit is running at $2.1 trillion annually. The Federal Reserve is trapped between cutting rates to save the housing market and raising rates to defend the dollar. Interest payments on the national debt consumed 23% of all federal revenue last quarter. America is financially overstretched, militarily committed on 3 fronts, and politically paralyzed by a Congress that can't pass a budget. Carney, the central banker, read the balance sheet, and he concluded that the United States cannot afford a reserve currency crisis right now, which means it's the perfect time to trigger one. This is where the situation moves from financial crisis to geopolitical crisis. The White House response has been nothing short of frantic. Sources say the president called Carney directly at 7:15 a.m. The call lasted 4 minutes. It did not go well. The president reportedly threatened to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to freeze Canadian government assets held in U.S. financial institutions. Think about what that means. The President of the United States is threatening to seize the sovereign assets of Canada, of NATO ally Canada, of Five Eyes partner Canada, the nation that fought alongside America in every major conflict since World War I. If the administration actually freezes Canadian assets, it doesn't just damage the U.S.-Canada relationship, it destroys the credibility of the entire dollar system. Because every nation on earth that holds reserves in dollars will ask the same question. If they did it to Canada, will they do it to us? Germany will move its reserves. Japan will accelerate its diversification. The Gulf states will begin pricing oil in euros. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency isn't maintained by military power alone. It's maintained by trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back. Here's what nobody is talking about yet. The bond market impact is only the beginning. Let's get technical about what happens to the American banking system when $1.2 trillion in foreign capital starts exiting. U.S. banks rely on foreign deposits and foreign purchases of bank-issued debt to maintain their capital ratios. Under Basel III requirements, the international banking framework that governs how much capital banks must hold against their liabilities, a sudden withdrawal of foreign funding forces banks to either raise new capital or reduce lending. There is no third option. The 6 largest American banks, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, collectively hold approximately $890 billion in foreign-sourced funding that is either Canadian-originated or routed through Canadian financial intermediaries. If Canadian institutions begin withdrawing that capital, which the Bank of Canada directive explicitly encourages them to do, the American banks face a liquidity squeeze. Not a 2008-style crash overnight, but a slow strangulation. Credit tightens, lending slows, small businesses can't get loans, mortgages become harder to qualify for, construction projects stall, hiring freezes spread, the economic engine seizes up. And it happens not because of a housing bubble or a tech crash, but because America's neighbor decided to take their money home. Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out on Main Street. A small manufacturer in Ohio needs to refinance a $2 million line of credit. Last month, the bank would have approved it at 7.2%. Today, the bank's funding costs have spiked because Canadian interbank deposits are draining. The new rate is 9.8%. The manufacturer can't afford it. They cancel a planned expansion. 23 jobs that would have been created vanish. Multiply that by 10,000 businesses across the country, and you begin to see the human cost of what happened in Ottawa this morning. And here's where it gets personal. The president's net worth is significantly tied to commercial real estate that depends on low interest rates and available credit. Every basis point that Treasury yields climb costs the Trump organization money. Every tightening of credit markets makes refinancing harder. The Canada crisis isn't just a national security problem for the White House. It is a personal financial threat to the man sitting in the Oval Office. Sources say the president has privately told advisors that Carney is conducting economic terrorism. He has reportedly floated the idea of imposing a 100% tariff on all Canadian imports. His trade advisor told him that would spike grocery prices for American consumers by an estimated 14% within 60 days, given that Canada supplies 22% of America's fresh produce, 35% of its softwood lumber, and nearly all of its potash fertilizer. The advisor was reportedly told to leave the room. Let's push the scenario to the extreme because the dominoes are already falling. The European Central Bank issued a statement at 11 a.m. Eastern today, expressing support for what it called Canada's sovereign right to manage its reserve portfolio. That language was carefully chosen. It wasn't neutral, it was an endorsement. Behind closed doors, according to a Reuters source in Frankfurt, the ECB has been developing its own contingency plan for dollar diversification since the tariff wars began. They've been waiting for someone to go first. Canada just volunteered. If the Eurozone begins moving even 10% of its dollar reserves into alternative assets, that's another $800 billion in selling pressure on US Treasuries. The Japanese Ministry of Finance, while publicly calling for calm, privately instructed its government pension investment fund, the largest pension fund on earth, to halt new purchases of American debt pending a review. The dominoes aren't just falling, they're accelerating. And here's the connection that nobody in the mainstream financial media has made yet. The Canada move doesn't just threaten the Treasury market, it threatens the entire U.S. defense budget. How? Because America funds its military through deficit spending, and deficit spending depends on cheap borrowing, and cheap borrowing depends on foreign demand for treasuries. If foreign demand collapses, borrowing costs surge. The Congressional Budget Office projected that interest payments on the national debt would reach $1.4 trillion this fiscal year. If yields spike another 100 basis points because of the Canada sell-off and the contagion that follows, that number jumps to $1.7 trillion. That's $300 billion more in interest alone. That money has to come from somewhere. It comes from defense, it comes from Social Security, it comes from Medicare. It comes from the programs that the 45 to 75-year-old Americans watching this video depend on for their retirement security. Carney didn't just attack the dollar, he attacked the American social contract. Whether he intended it or not, the downstream effects of this decision will be felt by every retired teacher, every veteran on a fixed income, every small business owner carrying variable rate debt. This is not abstract economics. This is your mortgage. This is your pension. This is your prescription drug coverage. What does this mean for the average American watching this right now? Here's the math that should terrify you. If the 10-year Treasury yield rises to 5.8%, which is where it's heading by Friday at this pace, the average 30-year mortgage rate hits 8.4%. A $400,000 home that cost $2,100 a month last year now costs $3,050 a month. That's an extra $950 a month. That's $11,400 a year in additional housing costs for the same house. That is the Canada tax. That is what happens when the world's largest trading partner stops funding your debt. Credit card rates will follow, auto loan rates will follow, student loan refinancing will freeze. The cost of American debt will go up for every single person in this country, not because of inflation, not because of a recession, but because Ottawa said enough. History teaches us that reserve currency crises do not resolve quickly. When Britain lost its reserve status after World War II, it took a generation for the economy to stabilize. When the French demanded their gold back from the United States in the 1960s, it triggered a decade of monetary chaos that ended with Nixon closing the gold window entirely. These are not small events. These are civilizational shifts. The founders of the Bretton Woods system built the dollar's dominance on the assumption that America would be a reliable steward of the global financial order. That assumption required stability. It required predictability. It required the kind of leadership that allies could trust with their national wealth. What we are witnessing today is the fracturing of that trust. This is not just about tariffs. This is not just about Canada. This is the stress test of the American century. Can the dollar survive when the nation's closest ally decides it's no longer safe to hold? Can the financial system absorb $1.2 trillion in outflows without cracking? Can the republic maintain its global standing when its own neighbors are fleeing the currency? We are in uncharted waters. The maps drawn at Bretton Woods in 1944 are useless. The assumptions baked into every pension fund, every retirement account, every 401k in America were built on the premise that the dollar is king. Today, the crown slipped. And here's the terrifying part that keeps former Treasury officials awake at night. A reserve currency doesn't collapse in one day. It dies by 1,000 cuts. Each cut looks manageable in isolation. A trade war here, a sanctions overreach there, an ally diversifying its reserves. But the cumulative effect is irreversible. Every foreign government that watches Canada walk away from the dollar and suffer no immediate catastrophic consequences becomes emboldened to do the same. It is a contagion of confidence loss. And once it starts, no amount of military spending, no aircraft carrier group, no sanctions regime can stop it, because the dollar's power was never really about force. It was about faith. And faith, once shattered, does not return on command. Watch the bond market tomorrow morning. Watch the DXY index at the Asian Open tonight. Watch for statements from the Bank of Japan, the ECB, and the People's Bank of China. Watch for the emergency G7 call that sources say is being scheduled for Thursday. But most importantly, watch what the president does next. It won't be diplomacy. It won't be negotiation. Sources inside the West Wing say the options on the table include sanctions on Canadian financial institutions, the deployment of economic emergency powers not used since World War II, and a directive to the Pentagon to reassess the defense posture along the northern border. Read that again. The northern border, the one that hasn't been militarized since 1812. For one nation sitting to the north, this was a calculated act of financial self-defense. For one man sitting in the White House, it is an existential threat to everything he has built. The dollar is bleeding. The alliance is shattered. And the world is watching to see whether America responds with wisdom or with rage. Canada has placed its bet. The question now is whether America understands that this is not a bluff. It's a beginning. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The history books are being rewritten in real time. And tomorrow it gets worse.